engaged very broadly throughout the UN system. So the focus here in New York is obviously on the institutions and agencies and organizations that are here. But the UN is actually much broader than just what happens in New York. So you saw a clip from the Human Rights Council. This administration took a decision that was difficult actually in 2009 to join the Human Rights Council, and it was difficult because the Human Rights Council is the body that succeeded the Human Rights Commission, which was a very challenged and politicized and ultimately ineffective human rights organization. The Bush administration had decided not to engage in the Human Rights Council. This administration did, and I think we have a lot to show for that engagement, although it still remains a challenged part of the multilateral system. And then whether it's on Ebola or on the climate change agreement or on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the nuclear agreement, undertaken on strengthening the system of peacekeeping and peacekeeping reform. And then this year, as I'll talk a little bit about, a real focus on strengthening the humanitarian part of the system. It is very easy to see UNGA as diplomatic speed dating, and that Secretary Kerry likes to refer to it. And it definitely has some of that feel. And we're engaged in all of these sort of set pieces. You saw clips from President Obama speaking at the UN General Assembly. That's something that he does every year. There are sort of things that happen every year as part of the UNGA schedule. It is also, again, a place where everybody is, and so we're also doing a lot of sort of bilateral and retail diplomacy all the time on the side. And we have tried to say, okay, we're all going to be here. We're all going to be here every year. We're all going to do some of these things that we do every year, but let's also try to be more strategic about how we use what ultimately is really the biggest diplomatic gathering in the world. And we have, over the past years, tried to come at specific strategic objectives that we would try to accomplish while we were also engaged in this diplomatic speed dating. This year, we have focused in particular on humanitarian response and peace and security issues and countering terrorism and violent extremism. You saw a number of clips that relate to the global refugee and migration crisis that we are facing as the global community. And there are now more people who are forcibly displaced around the world than at any time in history since World War II. And there are 65 million displaced people right now. Of that total number, about 2/3 are internally displaced within their own countries, and then the rest are refugees and migrants. And so we put a big focus this year, as did the broader UN membership, on trying to see what we needed to do as a global community to come together to get the right opportunity of being here to host with a number of countries and the UN Secretary a summit on the question of refugee. Was Gears paper and other ways that one gets their news these days is not unaware of the humanitarian. These are stretched their time, and they are consistently underfunded. The U.S. is the biggest humanitarian donor in the world humanitarian system. So we've set out this year to try to both increase overall the amount of money that the humanitarian system, that the UN agencies are, encourage countries that haven't to participate. So that was one we had. Another was just to increase the number of slots that are available in the world for refugees. Managed by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees or UNHCR, or alternative pathways for admission, just legal ways for people to enter third countries. We also made a big push to get other countries around the world to do the same. And then finally, and this was something that was very telling for me, we did a video, not this one, but at the Refugee Summit, we filmed a video and showed a video that shared in part this question of refugees who live in refugee camps, and they are all over the world, and I'm sure you all have seen photos, and maybe some of you have been to refugee camps at various points. And it used to be not that long ago that the average life of a refugee in a refugee camp was 9 years. The average life of a refugee in a refugee camp now is 25 years, and that number is growing. And so you have situations in some of the large refugee camps in Africa and other parts of the world where there are grandparents who have seen their grandchildren born in a refugee camp. And we continue as the international community to approach this problem as a humanitarian problem. So it's about making sure that people have shelter and making sure that people have food, which is very important. But when you're spending 25 years of your life in a refugee camp, you also need to be able to have a life. And so one of the things that we tried to do with the summit was to encourage these countries who have been incredibly generous in terms of hosting refugees for years and years and years to also think about the need to foster greater inclusion, opportunities for inclusion in their communities. So access to work, access to education. Many refugees are not able to go to school. Their kids are not able to school. They're not able legally to work. And so we made a big push on that this year as well. In the peace and security realm, I mean, I think the obvious issue that we may want to get into a little bit in discussion is the question of Syria. There was a UN Security Council meeting on Syria yesterday. There also is the International Syria Support Group. It has met twice. I was hoping I might have some news coming over here, but the International Syria Support Group was still meeting as I left, and I think they probably still are. So again, this is just an example of taking advantage of all of the countries being here. It happens that all of the members of the ISSG are here, so we've been able, the Secretary has been able, with his foreign minister counterparts, to meet in that forum a number of times already, as well as doing bilateral diplomacy with Russians and others, as well as participating in the Security Council session yesterday. But in Syria, obviously, there are many other crises in the peace and security, or South Sudan, or Somalia, and there's an opportunity for bringing together different groupings of countries that are engaged, including the countries themselves, to try to talk through and make progress on those issues. And while we've been focused also on last year, and you saw a clip from the president last year, which was aimed at encouraging countries. So we've had an opportunity this week to check in on how that effort is going, and also to put a greater focus on some of the other pieces of the UN architecture, which are so critical to solving peace and security challenges, like the conflict prevention and mediation and peace building. So we've put some focus on that this week as well. There have been several opportunities this week to engage around the question of climate change. Most of you are probably familiar, and we again saw a clip that the world community came together and actually agreed on a historic agreement last year in Paris around climate change. The effort that we're now engaged in is to make sure that that agreement actually enters into force, and we're hoping that it will enter into force this year. So there was an event yesterday that the Secretary of State participated in with countries that have already agreed to join the agreement, which includes the United States and others who are going to, with a goal of reaching over both thresholds this year, both on, we have to reach 55 countries and 55% of global emissions for the agreement to enter into force this year. So we're engaged in a robust effort around that. And then, I'm sure you're probably aware, there are just side event after side event after side event that go on, and that accounts in part for some of the celebrities in the private sector and others who come and engage around UNGA too. So we've had events on, a lot of events on climate change, we've had events on the Sustainable Development Goals, and the list goes on, and I'm happy to sort of try to talk through some of those issues. The business, of course, of multilateral engagement happens far and wide and far beyond UNGA. So although we have High Level Week and all the focus this week, and in fact the UN General Assembly will be meeting for the next few months in all of its committees to deal with everything from disarmament to human rights to the budget of the United Nations. But we're also engaged, whether it's in Paris at UNESCO or in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and the World Health Organization and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights or the ILO. And then in Vienna, we have the IAEA, which became quite well known around the Iran agreement, and the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, and then many other things that are somewhat unknown and also somewhat inexplicable, like the International Grains Council. There was a certain point in my job where I said I was discovering a new international organization every week. I'm not, I know most of them now, but sometimes still people come up with ones that I'm sort of like, what is that and why are we engaged in it? And at the same time that we're focused on all of these sort of pressing issues of the day, we are also always focused, especially as the United States, on making sure that the system is effective and efficient from a budget perspective, from a management perspective, issues that don't really sound all that interesting, but actually get back to something the Dean was saying very directly, and are particularly important from the perspective of the United States, because we pay close to a quarter of the budget of the UN every year. And we pay 28% of the UN's peacekeeping budget every year. So we pay far more than any other country into this system. So in a way, it's not surprising that we care more about how the money is spent, but it also is a very important issue for our Congress. And so part of this question around should we engage, will we keep engaging, will we be able to pay our bills, relates very directly to our ability to show that we are constantly making efforts to make the system more efficient and effective. And we have seen, I think, and some of you may have read about some sort of signature failures, especially in the last sort of year or two, which make that effort around the effectiveness and the efficiency of the system sort of much more difficult, both for us to justify and defend to the extent that we need to, and also incredibly frustrating for those of us who believe deeply in the system. And so it's one thing not to be able to run the appropriate experiment on whether it makes a difference when UN peacekeepers go into a country or not, and I think those are the kinds of questions that political scientists do try to get into in various ways. But that becomes, a much harder question is sort of how do you talk about the fact that there are UN peacekeepers who have engaged in really horrific, allegedly, sexual exploitation and abuse of the populations that they are sent to protect. And then we also, in recent years, have had to face the issue of cholera in Haiti, and the UN now just having come out for the first time in many years to admit that it actually had something to do with bringing cholera to Haiti, which was a sort of a well-known fact broadly, but is just something that has taken them a long and stumbling time to get to, and we're now waiting to see exactly what it is that the UN plans to do to try to address that. Having said all of that, and I am someone now who, both having worked inside of the UN and then covered these issues from the State Department, who believes very deeply in the system, but I also know very well what its flaws are. It is also the case that there's sort of no alternative for us. So I sort of started all of this by saying we have all of these global problems. There's no real way for us to address them on our own. And we were part of setting up this system, have a lot of pride in that. But also, I think people often say if we didn't have the UN today, we would have to create something like it. And I think in today's world, it would be very, very difficult for us to create something like it. And so that's why it's always important for us to both be cognizant of the problems and the reforms that are needed and try to address them transparently and address them head on and really take them on. And then at the same time also just understand that we need to be able to work through the system and we need to make it as effective as possible. And it can be quite an effective way for the US to advance things that we care a lot about. There is a race for Secretary General going on this year. It's the other election of importance this year. And so as Secretary General Bond sort of nears the end of his tenure, he's been in office for 10 years. His tenure runs out at the end of this year. We are also engaged right now very directly as a permanent member of the Security Council in the selection of the next Secretary General. So I'm sure there may be some interest in the room about that. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit as well. And I'm also happy to talk a bit about careers at the State Department or careers more generally in American diplomacy. There are lots of different ways to do that, so we can certainly get into that if there is interest. We obviously like to promote the Foreign Service and the Civil Service at the State Department in particular. The Foreign Service does offer you the opportunity to sort of go anywhere in the world. And have a pretty incredible career. The Civil Service is really the backbone of U.S. diplomacy. That's working at the State Department in Washington, D.C., and really does also offer a dizzying range of different career paths. So there's a careers section of the State Department homepage. There are careers in the UN system, and we can talk a little bit about that. And I'm supposed to tell you that you should follow us on Twitter at state_IO. And hashtag global leadership, which you see there. So but having now worked in and around the whole field of multilateral diplomacy for some number of years in different ways, I can tell you that it is incredibly exciting. It offers a huge range of activities because, as I often tell folks who are thinking about coming into our bureau, you almost cannot think of an issue on the international stage right now in which the UN is not engaged in some way. Maybe it's not engaged all that effectively, right, a la Syria, but it's engaged. And then there are kind of all kinds of really different interesting things you can do, whether you're interested in climate change, whether you're interested in poverty reduction, whether you're interested in the Sustainable Development Goals, humanitarian assistance, crisis response, the list goes on and on. So I'm happy to get into any of that and look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks for your remarks. I have a question about to what degree was the United States actually successful in convincing other countries to increase their commitments to United Nations peacekeeping efforts, and particularly how are we able to do that when we contribute, in terms of actual personnel, we contribute 68 people to UN peacekeeping missions, and countries like the Netherlands contribute 358, France 867. I imagine that is a touchy subject.
So you raise a very important point, and I think it's a point that I probably should have touched on when I was talking a little bit about what it means for the U.S. to exert leadership in the UN system. Because in an interesting way, even in areas, and I will answer directly your question in a minute, but even in areas like UN peacekeeping, where the United States itself does not provide an enormous number of troops to the operation, we are still able to drive the conversation and to drive commitments in a way that frankly was very interesting. And for those of us who were doing the diplomacy around it, it wasn't always that easy, right? Because it's one thing when we're talking about the effort we made this year on strengthening the humanitarian system. The U.S. has, again, by order of magnitude, we are the largest humanitarian donor in the world, and we also historically have a very strong record of taking refugees into this country. And I think on aggregate, we have taken more refugees into the United States than like all other countries in the world combined have taken into their countries. I'm not talking about refugee hosting countries, but actually resettled refugees in the United States. And those are records that we are very proud to stand on, and it makes it a little bit easier for us to push. In the case of peacekeeping, although we do not provide the boots on the ground, as it were, we do nonetheless foot about a third of the bill. So it's not that we're not participating, right? We're participating in a different kind of way. But we also we were able to sort of bring together a coalition of countries and use the weight of our diplomatic muscle, as it were, to really work with countries both that were interested in reforming the system and interested in strengthening the system, and also interested in engaging in peacekeeping by providing troops. And far from not having been successful on that effort, in fact, I think we had about 50 countries and international organizations that made commitments of troops and equipment to UN peacekeeping last year. And since the Peacekeeping Summit that the President hosted last year, we've had more commitments made. I think something like 25 new commitments were made over the course of the year from the last Peacekeeping Summit to this one. And these were real commitments, right? So it was upwards of 40,000 troops and helicopter units and all different kinds of things. I can't rattle them all off the top of my head, but whether it was a specific, the UN identified a number of specific gaps that they had in existing peacekeeping missions, and so some pledges were made to address those specific gaps, and other pledges were made around quick reaction forces, which is something that UN peacekeeping missions often need, and then other countries just made pledges of troops that could be available for future peacekeeping missions, or particular enabling capacities that are generally needed in UN peacekeeping missions that could be brought to bear in future ones. And so we have now been engaged in an effort with the UN and with other countries to now make sure that countries are following through on those pledges. At the same time, we did come forward as the United States last year, and the President on the day of the Peacekeeping Summit released a presidential memorandum on U.S. policy on UN peace operations. It was the first time in 20 years that we had a redefinition of the U.S. policy on UN peace, on our own contributions to peacekeeping and peace operations. And in that document, we made a number of commitments around things like doubling the number of staff officers, for example, that the United States provides to UN peacekeeping missions, as well as strengthening the focus that we place on conflict prevention and mediation and peace building, and bringing specific kinds of capacities to bear, whether in the realm of technological advances that the United States has or otherwise, that can be brought to bear in support of UN peacekeeping missions. And we've actually put some of that into action. So as an example, some of you may have seen in the spring, it feels like months ago now, it was months ago, it feels like a really long time ago, WFP did some airdrops, the World Food Program did some airdrops of food into certain areas of Syria that had been besieged. And they came to us by virtue of a commitment that we had actually made at the Peacekeeping Summit to see whether they could use U.S. Defense Department parachutes to do the airdrops. And in fact, we were able to provide those. That's not a peacekeeping mission, but it's an example of sort of a commitment that we made that was, brought to bear. So it's in part just, again, what I was talking about, the U.S. sort of the fact that we have re-engaged, the fact that we are at the table across the multilateral system, the fact that we have shown ourselves to be real partners in that effort has given us a credibility when we've been looking to build coalitions, whether it's a coalition to counter ISIL or a coalition in support of UN peacekeeping, that has just put us in a different kind of position. I mean, and so even in situations like that where you think, why would countries listen to us when we're sort of asking them to make contributions that we're not making? And again, the diplomacy around it isn't always easy, but we have actually been able to do it effectively. Okay, I don't know, where do I want to go with this? All right.
Thank you, Ms. Parker. So my question is about the Leader Summit on Tuesday, which member countries pledged to host, resettle over 300,000 new refugees. And the Obama administration is one of the organizer of the summit itself. I wanted to know how, what is the enforcement on that? How are you going to ensure that that actually happens, not only in terms of resettlement, but also in terms of the millions of dollars that were pledged at the summit?
So that's another very good question, and I alluded to the fact that we have been engaged now very directly in efforts to make sure that countries are actually following through on the pledges that were made last year at the Peacekeeping Summit. There's going to be a similar effort that's going to be needed this time around. And it is a very intensive effort. Last year, several countries that participated in the Peacekeeping Summit, among other things, made commitments at the summit that they would host follow-on meetings, which sounds like a very boring thing, but actually can be a very important part of actually sort of having opportunities to check in and make sure that countries are following through on their commitments. But and we co-hosted the Leader Summit with 6 countries. It's an effort that we're going to have to be engaged in, also on behalf of the UN, and we're just going to have to find ways throughout the course of the next year and looking out, right? Because several countries actually made multi-year commitments also in both financing and resettlement. To have these opportunities to check in and to continue to do the kinds of diplomatic work that we've been doing in advance of the summit to get the commitments made. Some of these commitments, like the peacekeeping commitments, were very difficult for countries to make, and in fact, in some instances, I think more difficult because it is a very difficult question and one that the United States has not, we haven't seen a way forward to re-engaging very robustly from a troop contributing perspective to UN peacekeeping. But that's a very difficult question for countries to make decisions around. It's much more difficult, and we have seen the political discourse in this country this year too, right? In our own country, which historically we've been so open to the idea of refugees. There's been bipartisan and very broad and deep commitment to that. And here too, this has now become part of the political discourse in sort of unfortunate ways at times this year. And that same discourse is going on in countries around the world. And so it was, in that sense, a particularly challenging time to be pushing countries to accept more refugees. And I think for anyone who live streamed the 5-hour summit that we held on Tuesday, you would have seen that a lot of countries were not all that specific at the summit itself about what their commitments were, and that's a reflection of the fact that even though they have made them, they understand that there are still difficult political dynamics in their own countries, and that's going to make it challenging to make sure that countries follow through, but it is a huge priority for us, and we have a lot of very committed partners both in the countries that participated and also in the co-hosts, and we'll have to just go about this collectively. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you again for taking time to come out and talk with us. My question kind of also goes on talking about refugees and migrants, but in a different part of the world. So in 2013, 2014, I think a lot of us know about the Central American child migrant crisis of a lot of children coming over the border, and not just children, people in their 20s as well. And there was at the State Department Counselor Thomas Shannon announced at the Senate committee meeting in July 2014, he said, we were working to provide support to Mexico's Southern Border Initiative and intend to provide around $86 million. So But there's been a lot of criticism within southern Mexico, especially with organizations working with migrants and refugees on the ground, including individuals from UNHCR saying that Mexico's southern border program has actually made refugees more vulnerable because it's pushing them into different routes to move through Mexico, and they're often getting picked up by cartels, etc. They have less access to the shelter system, etc. And so I just wanted to know what might be the State Department's response to financial support that is going towards this in southern Mexico.
So, I don't. I mean, I'm going to preface this by saying that the questions around the border and questions around refugees and migrants coming up through like the south, over our southern border is not something that I cover. Okay, so it's not a UN issue per se, although there is UNHCR involvement in Central America. So I'm not going to probably have an answer that is going to totally satisfy you. What I will say, but when have you ever heard a totally satisfactory answer from a US government official, if we're being honest? So what I can say is that, and Mexico was one of the co-hosts of the President's Summit, and in that regard, we worked with Mexico around the summit and the commitments that it would make to the summit, with a view to trying to get it to make commitments on improving the way that it processes and deals with asylees that are coming over its own borders. And so those are the commitments that Mexico made, and I think they actually really appreciated the opportunity that the summit provided, as we also heard from many countries, including Mexico, by the way, around the peacekeeping summit, to take a real look at what they were doing themselves internally in their own policies, whether it's a commitment to peacekeeping or whether in this case it has something to do with how many refugees they're taking or how they process asylum seekers, and take the opportunity provided by coming together on the global stage like this week, to take a hard look at those and maybe make some changes that were needed. And so that was the focus for the purposes of what we were talking about with Mexico, and its contributions to the summit. But I can't get into all of the specifics that you raised in your question.
My question is about Security Council reform. So in the past few days, today actually the president of Sierra Leone spoke about the need for reform. He said the process has been really slow, and he was speaking on behalf of Africa's Community of 10. Turkey's president has been in the past few years or 2 years making similar calls. The G4 ministers issued a statement saying, calling for the need to intensify efforts, but of course all of these groups envision something different, or many of them do when they talk about reform. So my question is, what is the US stance on this? Because it has sort of changed over the years, I guess. And also how can from America's perspective, how can the Security Council be reformed without compromising American interests?
Okay, so I mean, the last part of your question sort of really hit on the nub of the issue, and in fact, I think sadly, if you look back over time, the U.S. position on Security Council Security Council reform has not really changed all that much, and we have a pretty consistent set of talking points around it, which has to do with the fact that we are open in principle to a modified reform of the Security Council to include permanent and non-permanent members. But I think it will come, I mean, maybe as a surprise, but probably should come as no surprise that, when you look at and I talked about the vast array of international organizations and different organs of the UN system that are out there, for better or worse, as frustrating as engagement in the Security Council can sometimes be, it is by far the most effective organ that we have in the UN system, and the preeminent organ that we have for dealing with peace and security issues. And why is that important? Because we need it to actually function. And so this gets to questions when you talk about things like enlargement of the Security Council, both about how large the Security Council can reasonably be and still effectively take decisions, because I think, if you talk to our colleagues, Ambassador Power and others who deal in the Security Council setting every day, it is already very difficult with just 15 to get to effective decisions that need to be made. And so it's part a question of size, and it's also part a question of the level of responsibility that countries might feel or not when they come under the Security Council. It is an enormous responsibility. It's a privilege and an enormous responsibility to be a permanent member of the Security Council. And so we have been focused as much on the effective working of the Council, and that gets into questions of size and the rest of it, as we have on continuing to say that we believe that any country that has designs on becoming a permanent Security Council member has to approach that with a degree of seriousness and a degree of responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, which is ultimately what the Security Council is all about. So it can't be just about how important a country are you in the world, or are you emerging in a certain kind of way, or whatever. It also has to be about a real commitment to using the multilateral system for the maintenance of peace and security and the other fundamental purposes of the UN Charter. And in that regard, while we're talking about Security Council reform, one of our consistent talking points, which also has not changed over time, is that we are not in favor of any alteration or expansion of the veto. Where do we want to go now? Here?
Hi. I just wanted to see if you could elaborate on the election of the Secretary General this fall. What are the U.S.'s goals in electing the next Secretary General? Are you in favor of Guterres, or are you looking for an Eastern European woman? Do you have a favorite candidate?
Yes. So I'm going to be really frustrating when it comes to telling you our position on particular candidates, and it's just not something that we talk about publicly. And so and it's not something that we in fact even talk about to other countries. The U.S. has a position of not revealing our votes either before or after secret elections in the UN system. It's been a consistent policy of ours throughout our engagement in the system, and it impacts also how we talk about the Security Council race. And I'm going to say something that sounds very trite, and then I'm going to tell you why it's not actually as trite as it sounds. So the talking point that we have for what we're looking for in the next Secretary General is that we are looking for the best candidate for the job. Okay. Why is that not as trite as it sounds? First of all, because I think if you only look at the challenges that we have on our plates right now, it is actually very important that we make a decision based on who we think really has the right mix of qualifications and characteristics and qualities to be an effective Secretary General. And that has to do as much with international negotiating experience, diplomatic skills, the right kind of management skills. The UN is an enormous organization that needs to be managed, as it does with any considerations around a particular region or even gender. So although we have been very clear that we hope women are given equal consideration this year in the process, the talking point also is that we are looking for the best candidate for the job regardless of region and regardless of gender. There are some countries in the UN system that believe very firmly in this idea of regional rotation. And under that principle, the Eastern Europeans believe that it is their turn to have a Secretary General. They are the one region of the world that has not ever had a Secretary General. This is not a principle whether for this race of Secretary General when that comes up, or really in any other context that the U.S. ascribes to. So while there are some countries that feel very strongly about it, it is not one that we feel strongly about, and that's why I say it's not quite as trite as it sounds, right? Because it's one thing to say you're looking for the best candidate for the job from Eastern Europe. It's another thing to say you are really looking for the best candidate at the job. And ultimately, if you're serious about that, that has to be regardless of region and regardless of gender. And we do approach this, from that perspective, right? There are other countries in the Council who view it differently. So in terms of the particular candidates and sort of where the process is, I can say, as you probably have seen, because this is all supposed to be a secret process, and it all leaks within like 5 minutes of the straw polls occurring. And so that'll happen again on Monday when we will have the next straw poll. It is the 5th in the process. I think you have probably seen that there has been a lot more transparency around the process this year, and that is something that the U.S. signed on to last year and that we felt was very important. We've been pleased to sort of see the more transparent process this year. So that has meant, among other things, that all of the candidates have appeared before the full membership of the UN and had to answer questions, and the civil society was there as well and had the opportunity to ask questions. And they have all also had meetings with the Security Council, and they've all been going around and meeting in capitals and all manner of things. But ultimately, there is a certain part of the process that runs according to the UN Charter, and so that's the part of the process that we're in now, and the Security Council has a particular role to play. And so how that role is usually played is a series of what are known as straw polls, which are meant to winnow the field of candidates until the Security Council can agree on a candidate, and then the Council presents that candidate to the General Assembly, who then votes on the candidate. The winnowing has not gone quite as fast this year as it has in previous years, I think probably for a number of different reasons. And so although we are about to hold our 5th straw poll, we still have 9 candidates in the race. We started with 12. Guterres, as you have seen, former Prime Minister of Portugal, former High Commissioner for Refugees, has so far consistently performed the best in the polls. And then there are, there are 8 other candidates who are still in the mix as well. And at a certain point in time, we will see the process. The process hopefully should continue to move forward. At a certain point in time, we move to what is known as differentiated ballots. Right now, all 15 members of the council, I kid you not that the council has to come together and agree on procedures, which include how do you fold the ballot. So, it's literally like you fold it this way, and then you fold it this way, and everybody has to do exactly the same thing, and then it goes in a box, so that we're not supposed to know, and we don't know who has voted in what way. But then at a certain point in time, you move to a part of the process where the permanent 5 members have a different colored ballot. So there are 5 that are different colored from the other. That is important because a Secretary General candidate moves out of the council in the same way that any resolution moves out of the council, which is to say that it has to have at least 9 affirmative votes and no negative votes from a permanent 5 member of the council, because that would indicate a veto. So it could be, and hopefully should be, that when we move to that part of the process, it starts to go a little bit faster, because it will become more evident whether whether any of these candidates will actually have negative ballots by a permanent 5 member cast against them. Yeah.
Hi. What's your view on drone attacks in Pakistan and elsewhere in regards to the United States' commitment to human rights issues, considering the US calls every person who dies in a drone attack a combatant, and considering how little work there is to find out actually who dies and how many innocents become collateral damage?
So this is a question that I'm not going to dispute. It's just not a question for me to answer, because it's not an issue that I cover. So I think the administration has made a real commitment to enhance transparency around the process of the use of drones, and so I think that process is underway, but it is not a UN issue, and so therefore it's just not something that I cover in my day-to-day. So it's not probably worth my trying to answer that question, because it won't be an appropriate answer. Yep, over here.
So you mentioned IDPs and the ongoing problem of refugees having housing after the conflict, and I'm thinking specifically about the Balkans. As you know, there are thousands of families that are still waiting after 20 years since the conflict has ended to be placed into homes. And we know that one day the war in Syria will end. What kinds of lessons can be learned from previous refugee waves, like from the Balkans, and what kind of planning could be done now?
That's a very excellent question, and I think we could, I think we always are trying to learn from previous experiences like that or others. I mentioned the question of the inclusion of refugees in their host communities. I think that is something over time that we have learned really needs greater focus. And I think for those of you who focus on the question of development or humanitarian assistance, there also has always been this question about the relief to development gap, and sort of how do you move from humanitarian relief to development. And these kinds of questions get very much at that, because it's very applicable right now when we think about the Syrian refugees that are in the countries immediately surrounding Syria. We don't know how long it is going to take before those people can go home. and I think as Secretary Kerry said the other day, we should anticipate that we're only going to see more waves of refugees coming out before it gets better, at the same time that he is engaged very intensively to try to find a political resolution to the conflict. Which ultimately is what needs to happen, right? And so we have also been engaged with the countries in the region and with UNHCR and with other partners for the countries in the region to think about sort of what opportunities need to be provided for Syrian refugees that are there in the meantime so that they can work, so that their kids can go to school. And in fact, I think a lot of the reason that we're seeing such a big wave into Europe, which doesn't only come from Syria, by the way, and the summit the other day had a very global focus, very deliberately, because although there has been an enormous focus on the refugees coming out of Syria, in part because they've been landing in European countries, the wave of migration and forced displacement that we see around the world is also coming out of parts of Africa. It's also coming out of Afghanistan, and so it's not only a Syria problem, but nonetheless, there is a lot of I think a lot of the reason that we're seeing the sort of move toward Europe is also because these are people who want these kinds of opportunities. Right, and so we've got to figure out how, whether they're in Lebanon or Jordan or Turkey, or whether they make their way somewhere else, or whether they're in a refugee camp in Africa, that we find a better way of providing those kinds of opportunities. And sometimes countries need a lot of assistance in order to do that. But very much we need to make sure that people are productively engaged, that they are working, that they are able to go to school, so that hopefully when they do return home, you don't have this huge gap in their life, right, that is very difficult to make up from. And ultimately, all of this gets back to addressing the root causes, especially when you're talking about things like economic migration. And so that has to be part of the effort as well. Yeah.
All right, so this is going to be our last question.
It's a good question. Thank you for your talk.
A lot of pressure.
Yeah. So my question is related to the fact that we're in this sort of transitional period with both Obama and Ban Ki-moon leaving. So I'm curious to know what sort of policy change you foresee regarding the work of the Department of State with Russia, particularly given the lack of cooperation in Syria and the recent violations of ceasefire, the recent airstrike that killed 4 UN workers in the country.
So I should just note that when the president saw the Secretary General the other day, which is a meeting that he has every year as part of his UNGA schedule, the Secretary General actually said that he had done some research and discovered that this was the first time in the history of the UN that the US President and the UN Secretary General were turning over in the same year. So for whatever it's worth. But it does make it feel, not to be flip about it, it does make it feel like there is a real sort of potential for even more tumult and certainly transition. You point out an issue in terms of U.S. bilateral relationships, which is deep and important and has been very challenging in recent years. And I think you have probably seen, just by looking at the news, the degree to which John Kerry is engaged every day in diplomacy with the Russians, particularly around the Syria question. I can't really answer how U.S. policy toward Russia might change and continue to evolve. Russia is an important player on the global stage and one that we have to engage with in numerous different ways every day, right? And so there's an enormous focus on Syria right now. There has been an enormous focus on Ukraine, which is another challenge that we've been addressing. But at the same time, if you look at, for example, the workings of the Security Council, where Russia also is a permanent member, at the same time that it's been very hard for us to make progress on some of these sort of key geopolitical challenges, and that's been frustrating, right? And Russia has frustrated that for the past many years in Syria in particular, with the use of its veto. It is also the case, if you look at what the Security Council has been up to for the past several years, that we have gotten a lot done, and we have had to get a lot done with all the permanent 5 members of the Council supporting that, right? And so as an example, on Wednesday, yesterday I guess it was morning, before the Syria session in the Council, there was a session on the Colombia peace agreement, which was is a huge good news story that has just, and amazing that the country has actually gotten to this point. And we, last week as the Council, there was the second Security Council resolution on the situation in Colombia. And it was a resolution that was co-sponsored and introduced by all 15 members of the Council. It went through unanimously by consensus. And yesterday there was this enormously good feeling in the Council with the President of Colombia there presenting an actual copy of the peace agreement to the President of the Security Council, who happens to be New Zealand this month. And so it's not to pretend that these other issues aren't there, but just to note that at the same time that those issues are there and they remain difficult and they will continue to remain difficult, I don't, among other things, think that we should be expecting a transition in leadership in Russia anytime soon. It is also the case that we find ways to deal with Russia on a number of different issues that also are important to the United States. And it is critical to us that we do have those ways, right? And that we are able to address other issues that we also care about with Russia and with the other members of the Security Council and more broadly with the international community. So it's not a precise answer to your question, but just to note that it's very complex, right? And we can't cabinet on only one issue because we are a member of this global community in the same way that any other country is. We are a member of the UN in the same way that any other country is. And if we want that system to work effectively, we have to find different ways to work with all of the different member states of the UN. And in the Council's case in particular, we work day in and day out, and we have for 71 years with the Russians on the business of the Council.
But we'll try, that would avert war. And for all the faults in that system, it is one that has worked well and is under stress and duress. But it was very useful tonight to hear about the efforts of the Obama administration to sort of put the US in a leadership position in the United Nations system and other international organizations like the World Health Organization and International Monetary Fund, et cetera, these legacy organizations out of the Second World War. And I think we can also all agree that we are very fortunate to have such a diligent and intelligent, well-spoken advocate for the United States and for that order and her team, who has been outstanding in coordinating this. So I would like to thank you all. You are a pleasure to work with, Melissa and everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm sure that your thoughts and comments tonight, Madam Secretary, have helped us understand a bit more some of the issues. And I have no doubt that they may be popping up in research papers that I'll be reading. So thank you so much for taking your time, and thank you all for coming. And have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I have to just say that I thank this guy in particular for laughing at all my jokes. I live in Washington, obviously, and I'm actually from Washington, D.C., and that means that my parents still live in Washington. So when I give talks in Washington, a lot of times my mom comes, and she can always be counted on to laugh at my jokes. But she wasn't here this evening, so thank you for stepping in admirably to fill that role.
Well-spoken advocate for the United States and for that order and her team, who has been outstanding in coordinating this. So I would like to thank you all. You are a pleasure to work with, Melissa and everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm sure that your thoughts and comments tonight, Madam Secretary, have helped us understand a bit more some of the issues. And I have no doubt that they may be popping up in research papers that I'll be reading. So thank you so much for taking your time, and thank you all for coming. And have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I have to just say that I thank this guy in particular for laughing at all my jokes. I live in Washington, obviously, and I'm actually from Washington, D.C., and that means that my parents still live in Washington. So when I give talks in Washington, a lot of times my mom comes, and she can always be counted on to laugh at my jokes. But she wasn't here this evening, so thank you for stepping in admirably to fill that role.